Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for attending and registering for this session, Countering Violent Extremism in East Africa, with a focus on civil society engagement and dialogue with extremist groups. Violent extremist organizations in East Africa have displaced millions and killed. Countering violent extremism is a strategy that recruits community leaders, social workers, and teachers to assist the government in identifying individuals that may be at risk of becoming violent extremists. But is it effective? This session will be a dialogue between countering violent extremism experts working to mitigate the appeal of extremist narratives in East Africa. The moderator for this session is Dr. Halkano Wario. He is the Associate Director at the Center for Study of Terrorism, Violent Extremism, and Radicalization at the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. This is a applied research and policy think tank based in Nairobi, Kenya. He's also a senior lecturer in religious studies at Egerton University, Kenya. Over the past few years, he studied the dynamics of CVE and violent extremism in the Horn of Africa region in general and Kenya in particular. I will now pass on to Dr. Wario, who will introduce our other speakers.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to moderate this discussion. You all can hear me properly, can you? Thank you so much, and I'm extremely glad to be a part of this discussion today. And today we have two speakers who are going to interrogate the role of civil society organizations, especially in countering extremism in the region of the Horn of Africa. The first of the speakers is Dr. Marin Jiri. She works with the Intergovernmental Organization on Development called IGAD, which is an 8-member country organization that brings Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, and Somalia, and Djibouti, and Ethiopia. And IGAD is one of the key organizations that has been forefront in addressing the problem of violent extremism from a regional perspective. The second speaker that we will have today is Omar Mahmoud. Omar Mahmoud is a senior analyst and a specialist on the Horn of Africa, and he works with International Crisis Group, one of the leading international organizations that analyze this conflict, not just in the region, but across the world. And both of these speakers will interrogate the role of civil society organizations in countering violent extremism, but generally also to give us an overview of the violent extremism situation, specifically in the region as a whole for Dr. Marin Jiri. But for Omar, he will focus on the violent extremism situation in Somalia. And he will speak a little bit more about how the situation is at the moment, given that since 2007, a group by the name of Al-Shabaab, which is an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, has been forefront in destabilizing the country and literally has strong control over some part of southern central Somalia for a couple of years, despite the international efforts to address the same problem. And again, the country has been going through political crises, especially among the political elite, and for a long time, both the presidential and the parliamentary election has been postponed for some time. And currently, I think if one watches Somalia, one can feel the level of political engagement, pushes the whole focus from violent extremism towards now this transitional elective politics, which in a way undermines ability of both regional countries, the international community, AMISOM, and others to fight violent extremism. Now, you are today attending this auspicious occasion, which has been organized summit, and the theme of this year is peace and security, peace, health, and development. And these themes are quite central in Africa today, because as a continent, we just emerging from the global crisis that has been occasioned by COVID-19 for the last 2 years. And Africa has been one of the countries that has been most hit in terms of economies, in terms of people's ability to have buying power and so on. And if one looks at broader across Africa, apart from the Horn of Africa, other parts of Africa are also experiencing similar upsurge in violent extremist activities. Take the case of the Sahel, for instance, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and the surrounding countries are at the moment in quite a big crisis, both political and also in upsurge of both Daesh-linked affiliate and also Al-Qaeda-linked affiliate that have created this buffer zone of operation. If you look south, the border between Tanzania and Mozambique has seen since 2017 onward also a growing insurgency, jihad insurgency, by a group that affiliates itself with Daesh. And similarly, if you look at DRC's eastern part and western part of Uganda, a group by the name of ADF have a very strong link with Daesh at the moment. Now, my first question is to Dr. Njiri. Dr. Njiri works with IGAD, and she works with a center that specializes in study of extremism. And Dr. Njiri interacts extensively with regional governments in their effort to address the problem of extremism. At the same time, they also engage with youth, with civil society organizations, with the development partners in addressing this problem. So my first question to Dr. Njiri is, from your own perspective, can you please give us an overview of violent extremism context in the region as a build-up? And then my also first question after Dr. Njiri is to Omar. Being a specialist on the Horn of Africa, being a specialist on Somalia, can you give us an overview of the trends that are there, especially in relation to understanding of this Al-Qaeda affiliate by the name of Al-Shabaab, one of the most resilient and virulent violent extremist organization we have in the region? Dr. Njiri, to you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Halkano. I'm also privileged to be here today to discuss on the initiatives that we have undertaken as an organization. But maybe I can start by saying that the threat of violent extremism, as we know, in the Horn and the Eastern African region, is that which has exponentially grown over the years, is that we are seeing a change in the tactics these groups have used. We are seeing a mutation of how the violent extremism organizations have operated. And this has called for us as the IGAD Center of Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism, then to also change our initiatives to augment them so that then they are able to respond to these threats. And maybe I can say at this point that we just don't do these initiatives. We have been guided by a regional strategy for preventing and countering violent extremism in the Eastern African region, which actually is the first strategy in this region then that is able to document how these threats can be dealt with. And it is out of this then that we have these pillars of engagement where we are working with the state and non-state actors. And broadly speaking is that we work towards the area of strengthening the regional capacity, strengthening. The other pillar is strengthening the capacity of at-risk communities, where is the area where we have now worked extensively with youth and civil society organization. And maybe I can just say, broadly speaking, as I come back to the civil society and how we have worked with them, is that we also have the research and knowledge sharing pillar. We also look at how we can strengthen the rule of law and justice and enhance capacity for diplomacy. So these are the broad pillars that we have worked at. But the key one is that then when we are working with the youth and civil society under the pillar of strengthening the capacity of at-risk communities, is that we strive to adopt the whole of society approaches so that we are able to extensively engage the civil society, and so that then we are able to have initiatives then that are able to make an impact on the ground. I can also maybe add at this point that we have managed to have a very strong network of the civil society and the youth, which has been very, very integral for us to be able to realize our objective. And under this, we have been able to have a number of things that we have done with these groups. We do capacity building for these groups, which I'm going to explain later on as we continue on with the questions. But maybe just to say that we have had a digital hub where we have been able to bring the civil society organizations together and the youth networks and so on, so that then we are able to interact with them further. I would call it's a multilingual online platform where we are able then to continue the conversations with them in terms of how they are carrying on the initiatives and trying to see how we can augment and the gaps that are there. So Dr. Halkano, I don't want to say much. There's a lot that we are doing at the center, and the focus is it's very narrowed in this discussion. So I hand it over back to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mary, we will come back to you to look at the challenges of working with civil society organizations in the region in terms of addressing the problem of extremism. I personally have taken part in some of the events that are organized by IGAD, especially the center that studies PCV, and then we'll come back to this because there's a whole spectrum of civil society actors which bring their own different positionality in terms of interest, in terms of addressing the problem of VE. So we will come back to that. But coming to Omar, recently there's been quite an upsurge in the level of violence that have been meted out against civilians and government installations by group Al-Shabaab. Kindly, before you now look at how this problem is being addressed in Somalia, give us an overview of the security situation at the moment in Somalia for our audience, given that Somalia sits quite close to Yemen, which is one of the theaters of civil war that's currently going on. And I think ISG has done tremendously analytical work around this. But give us an overview for the audience on the security situation in Somalia. Over to you, Omar. Kindly unmute. Omar, I can hear you from this side. Dr. Mary, can you hear Omar?
No, I can't. It's Dr. Martha, Dr. Halkano.
Okay, Dr. Martha, can you hear him? Sorry.
No, I can't. I can't hear him.
Right. I also can't hear him. But as we sort out the connectivity problem with Omar, please, Dr. Martha. IGAD has been forefront in addressing the problem of violent extremism in the region. One of the things that you had mentioned is IGAD has a strategy which is expected to have been adopted by all these regional countries in the IGAD. Omar, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you guys fine. I don't know if you can hear me now. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm not sure.
Kindly give us an overview of the security situation in Somalia, and then perhaps build up a little bit on what is being done by government agencies and civil society organizations in addressing the problem of extremism. Then before we can now look at the international coalitions that is helping addressing the problem, AMISOM and so on, because there's quite a lot of things going on at the moment in terms of also expiry of the term of the AMISOM, and this of course impacts. But just give us a bit of the security situation currently in Somalia for our participants to understand.
Yeah, sure. Well, essentially in Somalia, you've had this struggle against Al-Shabaab, which has been going on for 15 years now. And it's gone through a number of different evolutions, a number of different changes. The group is highly adaptable, and we've seen them kind of adapt to in a way that actually keeps them, they're more agile, they're able to stay a step ahead of kind of the government and its allies on that side. And so currently right now, essentially you have this picture where the Somali government is in a lot of the urban centers in South Central Somalia, so the capital Mogadishu, some of the other big cities, and those are under government control, and that's backed up by the African Union peacekeeping forces as well. But this doesn't really extend outside these urban areas, which are really more kind of isolated pockets in between. So even travel on road between some of these can be quite perilous as well. And so what you have is in this countryside area, the rural areas, you have Al-Shabaab being the dominant actor in a large swath of this. You have some other smaller actors in certain areas, but for the most part, Al-Shabaab is quite dominant in the countryside. So essentially, you have this rural-urban divide that's happening right now in the country. And so Al-Shabaab being dominant in the rural areas, it means that they're able to generate financing by taxing along the roads, the traffic that kind of goes through these areas. It means they're able to kind of resupply themselves in terms of recruitment as well through their access to rural populations. And then what's happening now on the urban side is actually an adjustment by Al-Shabaab where they've been able to infiltrate some of the urban centers as well. So even in the capital of Mogadishu, Al-Shabaab has this shadow administration where they exert taxes and obviously undertake attacks as well. So I think you have this kind of divide, but then you have the seeping of Al-Shabaab into even the urban government areas, and you don't have that same response, that same seepage back from the government into the rural areas so much, but really the government being a bit more hunkered down. But having said that, I think we need to understand also, of course, what Al-Shabaab is, because at some level, yes, they are a violent extremism actor that engages in terrorism. And we see these attacks, you know, horrific ones that happened in Mogadishu even this week as well. But at the same time, you know, Al-Shabaab is also a governing actor. You know, they are a competitor to the government in this. They do provide services in the rural areas and areas under their control. You know, we've done plenty of interviews where even government officials will go to Al-Shabaab areas to adjudicate disputes in Al-Shabaab courts and these types of dynamics. So Al-Shabaab is very much a governing actor as well. And then, of course, you know, they've developed this mafia-style extortion element, criminal element, I guess, in the urban areas as well. So I think the group is you know, quite diverse and covers a lot of different frames. So I don't think we should always just see it as a terrorist actor, but also as kind of a governing actor as well.
Now, you bring a very interesting dynamic, which probably, again, Dr. Martha can reflect on, because from the perspective of regional governments and also bodies like IGAD and so on, Al-Shabaab is often looked at as a political actor that is a spoiler in a country that has been having civil war and destabilized for a long period. Now, how before I come to Dr. Martha to address the same, how can one now deal with an organization that is both a governing actor, a political spoiler, an extortionist, a criminal network that extorts? You know, there's this special panel of report, for instance, from October last year that gives this intricate understanding of how this extortion goes on and so on. How from the ICG's analytical perspective, how can one deal with such an actor that interacted in both, you know, social fabric of the people, but at the same time is a political spoiler in Somalia? Should one think around the question of perhaps dialogue, negotiation, a kind of broad-based government that both applies the aspiration that Shabaab stands for of applying the Sharia? Or how do we go about it? And then Dr. Martha can come in also to give us an understanding of how do we deal with an actor that has a broad spectrum of positionality in Somalia's politics. And Al-Shabaab affects not just Somalia only, but say Kenya. We have been having a problem here in Kenya, especially in Lamu, in the border regions between Somalia and Kenya, in northern parts of Kenya. It's also have targeted Uganda, for instance, before. And being an Al-Qaeda affiliate, then it has all this, you know, regional network with cells and sympathizers across. Over to you, Omar, first. And then
I think that's a really good question and something worth exploring. So that's what makes actually countering Al-Shabaab so complicated, because they aren't just a simple actor in one sense or another. They're not just a simple terrorist actor, but they are, as you mentioned, very embedded into the fabric of Somalia and Somali society, and they've probably become more embedded over time. That's one of the adjustments they've made, you know, specifically. And I don't think the international response and the federal government response in Somalia as well has really kept up with that adjustment. You know, rather, there's still a very military-centric approach. This idea that you can, you know, you can fight the group, you can try to defeat them or at least degrade them, and through military means. And, you know, that doesn't take into account the complexity of this group and how further they have embedded themselves. And so at ICG, what we would argue, you know, a little piece of research we're working on now is there the prospect to undertake some non-military approaches, some alternative approaches, because the military approach for the past 15 years, we would argue, just hasn't really worked, hasn't provided results. And one of those options would be dialogue, engaging in the group in some sorts of negotiation. Now, I understand that's a very difficult subject. It's a very tricky one. There have been probably some attempts at dialogue in the past that haven't worked as well. So we need to learn the lessons from those, and you have to even kind of tease out this idea of whether even Al-Shabaab would be interested in this sort of approach. But I think it's another toolbox, another tool in the box we should be adding, because right now it's you know, predominantly this military theme. There is no political track. But at the end of the day, a lot of the grievances, a lot of what Al-Shabaab's arguing is quite political. You know, there's the ideological element, of course, but there is this political grievance, there's this political narrative that is, you know, something that has some buy-in as well. And so we would argue that, you know, at some level, you have to try to explore this idea of discussions and see where that can go as well, and add that tool to the toolbox.
Then I'll bring in Dr. Martha in from a regional perspective as a policy practitioner who has experience in working across the region. How do you perhaps suggest that we should address the problem of extremism, especially through empowerment of society organization? Over to you, Dr. Martha.
Thank you, Dr. Halkano. And I'll have to state that the conversation is very interesting with what Omar is saying, because it's very specific, especially in terms of the Al-Shabaab being this group. But I'll take us back to how, you know, the civil society or the non-state actors, then how do they come in to handle this issue? And maybe one of the challenges I can highlight, because you first asked me about the challenges before Omar came back, is that you know, there has been a lot of very difficult working relations between the state and the non-state actors. There's a lot of suspicion by the state actors, the civil society. How then are they, engaging in the PCV initiatives and so on. And I'll say from a regional perspective is that one of the main challenges then that we have realized is this issue of the state and non-state actors working together. And as such, then we have come up with a collaboration framework where they can be able to, and also maybe to say that it is not only this challenge then that has been faced by these actors, is that additionally then we are having issues with the non-state actors themselves. How do they work among themselves? And so we now have also developed engagement strategies for this engagement strategies in the region, so that then we work towards preventing and countering violent extremism. Then they have a very strategic way of doing this. Maybe I'll add and just say this, is that there has been a bit of duplication of activities, which is why we have seen it very important then to work with the civil society and other actors and come up with these engagement strategies for them. So I will not speak from a Somali perspective, because we have not dealt with them, at a very specific level, but on a very regional level. So I can only speak at the regional initiatives that we are undertaking, which is more of the engagement strategies of how they can best work towards the preventing and countering violent extremism. And of course, we are cognizant that they need to have the tools, the proper tools for them to be able to do that. So we apply a lot of strategic communications. How do they do these narratives? How do they communicate? How do they have these alternative narratives against these extremist narratives? So Dr. Halkano, I would say largely speaking is that we are working through engagement strategies, and additionally using other initiatives such as strategic communications to see how then we can address this challenge. Yeah, thank you very much.
Given that IGAD has quite trained large number of society actors from Uganda, from Kenya, from Somalia, from Ethiopia, from Djibouti, including even sometimes from, it's IGAD plus Tanzania, so from Tanzania, how has been, how effective has been this capacity building opportunity for these civil society actors? Have they been able to apply what they have learned through engagement with IGAD? What do they say of the knowledge gain? And I'm sure this contrasts entirely with the picture in Somalia, where the civil society organization in Somalia may have a different attitude of how to deal with Al-Shabaab in the first place, because Shabaab is quite entrenched in the society, and so a lot of targeting individuals who try to address the problem of which will come to Omar. But from IGAD's experience, how has been the actors that you have built their capacity? How effective this capacity building initiatives? Dr. Martha, and then I'll come to Omar.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Halkano. I can say that it has been effective. I can say that because in terms of the initiatives that they are able to undertake, we have seen a more narratives, for instance, are coming from them. They are able to share with us. We actually have a database of these narratives that they are using. We have now seen, and in the wake of the challenge that we were able to have, the COVID-19, is that they have been able to apply, and they have reported. We have success stories which we'll be sharing of how then they have been able to do the prevention of through the narratives, for instance. I would say that it has also been very effective in terms of them coming together as networks. So they're no longer operating as individual organizations, but through our training, we have been able to bring them together, and they are now working as networks. For instance, in Uganda, they now have a very strong network. In Kenya, they have a very strong network. So when they are doing these initiatives, they are no longer doing it, alone as a civil society organization, as an individual, but rather as a network of these organizations, which for us, we are seeing it as a success for us, because when we started, we didn't have the networks really. They worked alone as standalone organizations, but we now realize that they're now able to come together. They are able to even look for funding as a group, as a network, and are able to do their own local initiatives on the ground on what is working best with them. And what Omar is talking about, dialogue, they have also been able to engage the elders on the ground. They have been able to work with local researchers as well. So I can say from my point and where I sit is that we are seeing these, being very successful on our end. And we are proud to say that indeed, yes, we have learned a number of things along the way. That they cannot work alone. And so through the networks, we are doing a good job. And through the digital, in fact, through our digital hub now, because we have them on the hub, we are able to see the conversations and the initiatives they're taking in the grassroots areas, because they share them on our platform. So I can be able to say authoritatively that indeed our initiatives are working in bringing them together. Our initiatives are helping them to be able to come out strongly in terms of the activities that they in preventing and countering violent extremism. Yeah, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martha, for this. Two things, Omar. One is the current political infighting in Somalia, especially between different political entities, alliances, between the sitting president who had extended his term and still in power, and he's also a presidential candidate, the electoral process. All this political infighting, in a way, from my perspective, impacts on ability of international communities, the Somalian National Army, the Somalian government in fighting against VE. But at the same time, Somalia has been a country that has had very unstable government since 1981. Civil society organizations are extremely instrumental in provision of services, from education to health, remittances, management of all this real estate, and so on. CSOs are integral part of Somalia's development structure, but they are not necessarily very much involved in addressing the problem of VE. Kindly reflect for the audience here what the civil society organizations in Somalia are doing generally, but also in particularly in addressing the problem of violence. Secondly, then reflect on the current political turmoil in Somalia, if we could use that term, in terms of it impacting on ability of either Somalia government and also its partners in fighting the VE. So two things, CSOs and the political situation in Somalia in relation to fighting groups like Shabaab. Omar, to you.
Sure, thank you. I think I'll start with the political situation. And I think this is probably one of the key detriments in the struggle against Al-Shabaab, is that you have a lack of common vision amongst the Somali political elite. And so you constantly have this level of infighting. And a lot of this actually dates back to deep-seated grievances that were never really resolved. There was never a coherent process of reconciliation, which I think has held back South Central Somalia quite a bit. But then some of this has been exacerbated through this state-building approach. You know, you have this federal government in Somalia that's heavily backed by international actors, that's tried to expand itself over the past 10 years or so, and has made progress, has definitely deepened its roots in the country. But at the same time, state building is not always the same thing as peace building. So we've seen some times where the state has expanded, where the state has been able to deepen its roots, but it's also aggravated communities locally. It's either been their interventions have been politicized, or they've ignored local grievances and whatnot. So you've actually had a process where, yes, the state has expanded, but in a lot of cases, grievances have expanded as well. So it's hard to say whether that's the right approach, or whether there's been enough attention focused on the peace building side of things. And so I think that's reflected in the current discussions, in the current debate. You've had a government whose mandate expired over a year ago, is still in power. It's been very difficult to get this sort of election ongoing, and it's still start and stop. But the wider effect that has is a government that's distracted and inward looking, and not focused on the battle against Al-Shabaab then as well. And the group is very good at exploiting these kind of differences. This is why we've seen attacks go up in the past 2 months on kind of some of the key election venues and election sites, because the group is very good at exploiting these grievances. So as long as that level of lack of common vision and infighting is there, I think on the Somali actor side, the political elite side, then I think that provides space for a group like Al-Shabaab, unfortunately. Now, when it comes to civil society organizations, I think there's kind of maybe two types of civil society organizations, just very generally speaking, in Somalia. You have a very intricate social network in Somalia, this very complicated but deep clan system that goes on through the country. And so you have, this role of traditional clan elders and whatnot, and they carry, a good amount of weight in their particular localities. And so in one sense, that is a civil society organization in itself, and something that can be relied on. And then you have maybe the more traditional civil society organizations we see, which are probably more in the urban centers and probably a bit limited as well in their reach. But I think one interesting thing from the Somali civil society perspective, or at least from some of the research and some of the interviews we've done, is they are actually some of the ones that are really driving this debate now about whether you need to change the military-centric approach in Somalia, whether you need to engage this group, Al-Shabaab, maybe you need to find some alternatives. It's not necessarily coming from the political side just yet. It's actually more the civil society side that's asking, why has this war been going on for 15 years? There's quite frustration with the status quo. And so it'll be interesting to see maybe post-election whether that kind of dynamic from the civil society can continue and materialize and actually influence the political side as well. But I think you definitely see civil society actors kind of raising these questions and serving that voice for alternatives.
Both of your discussions have really ignited quite a lot of questions that are being raised by participants online. So I will go through a bit of it before we come back to both Omar and Dr. Martha. And Omar, I would want you to speak a little bit about AMISOM and its impending, either extension or exit from Somalia as one of the peace stabilizers and builders. And then Dr. Mary also looking at the challenge the CSOs actually face when they address the problem of extremism. but then a couple of questions have been raised, so I will go quickly through it. One of the attendants, one of the participants is calling on civil society in East Africa to do much more on to collaborate more on technology. What the online digital hub, and this is being raised as one of the strategies. So another person also raises the role of strategic communication to enhance civil society effort to prevent violent extremism, and this can be said to contribute to national and terrorism. Also, again, the whole of society approach should be consistent across the region and should try to address the problem of vulnerable populations. Then there is also one question particularly directed, perhaps, which you can both address, but quite a very instrumental one. Why do people become extreme? Why do people choose to be extremists, and who forces them to do that, or are they forced to do that? And so I will wish when you answer, you start from the perspective, why do people become, join this extremist organization, or why do they pick up this extreme position? Then another participant also is raising, if Al-Qaeda may be viewed as a political actor, what will you say are their political aim? And is there any other way the Somalia government should effectively work with them to bring peace? I think this question should be to Omar. Then there is also a question directed to Dr. Martha. Could Dr. Martha talk a bit more about the reception of this CSO initiative of tracking changes, not in terms of CSO activities, but from the stories of change, of perception of extremism or de-radicalization in the communities by young people, for example? What sort of CSO intervention have shown most impact, and what lesson can be learned from the other CV actors across the continent? Dr. Martha, I think this question is rightly done for you, and the question of how to deal with Al-Shabaab, especially from the government side in Somalia, is to Omar. So let's, Dr. Martha, to you first. We have about 20 minutes to go. Still.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Wario. I agree that the civil society, they need to collaborate more technologically. The role of strategic communications in PCVE is very, very integral. In fact, we cannot win the war against violent extremism without communications, because they largely use communications to actually recruit and radicalize people. The whole of society approach, true, it should be consistent. I agree 100%. Why do people become extremists? And this has been one of the very contentious issues, because there are different factors that are going to lead people to become extremists. And when we look at it, of course, we look from the factors. It can be pull factors, it can be push factors, and we are seeing, in this day and age, that so many other things then are leading people to become extremist. But as we do know, and research, the component of research is really integral. Just listening to Omar and how on the ground, the civil society is different, from what we know it to be, tells me that we need to research more on these factors that are pushing people to become extremists. But of course, and largely speaking, it has been known, it can be economic factors, social factors, political factors, broadly speaking, and of course, unresolved grievances and so on. So a number of things do lead people to become extremists, but of course, it is a process. And that is why when I speak from the IGAD perspective, is that I say for us, it's more, we want to push more of preventive measures, but we do acknowledge that sometimes countering is the only way to go. But the issue of why people become extremists is one which is quite contentious, and one which is very broad, because it's a complex, array of factors that push people finally to join these groups and to become violent extremists. We know, being extremism sometimes, and we can debate about this, is not essentially a bad thing. But when it now pushes to become violent extremism, then this becomes a problem. Which is the most initiative that has shown a lot of impact? And for me, I'll go back to the issue of communicating through the narratives. I mean, for us, this has been quite successful because we have seen the civil society go down, and the civil society organizations use their own languages to be able to reach out to these groups. And we have seen the civil societies from these narratives work towards pulling people out. And in fact, currently we are now working towards programs on rehabilitating individuals who have been in these groups, or who have shown interest in joining these groups, and the civil societies are really leading us with this one on the ground. So for me, I would say that the narratives, and I'm going to say this at this point, is that a lot of research maybe needs to be done to be able to show really the impact. I think studies do lack. But for us, the narratives that they are sharing in their media platforms, and the ones that they are forwarding to us, the audio, the posters that they are using to use, I would say for me that has been the most impactful from where I sit. And of course, they're initiating a dialogue on. I think for me, I still go back to the communications. I think that is what has been very impactful, but it has also taught us that working with the local civil society is also very impactful in our work, because they understand the things on the ground, the people listen to them, and they are able to integrate them even as they do these initiatives. I do believe that I have tackled a number of things. Thank you.
Now, and you've answered the question that was asked. There's a particular question to Omar, which I also wrote it down because it was quite standing out. State building is not the same as peace building, and I found that fascinating. So someone else also noted it and has asked a question to Dr. Omar. State building does not always mean peace building. Considering this statement, do you think states' alliance with international actors has resulted in silence of the CSOs and local voices in peace building? You know, we have now the state-centric discussion around it, which you have already, I think, tackled and mentioned, but you can still a little bit build on that. And again, in other words, do you think the international and state agenda often dominates the social-cultural landscape and overlooks the internal dynamics of the state? So this particular question wishes you to interrogate how CSOs have either been silenced, or the agenda has been often dominated by that. And then there is one other question, one other comment, I think, from one of the participants, which goes like this. I think that going deep into reason for extremism is very crucial to understand this phenomenon. Is it a question of belief or lack of understanding, or simply a reaction to physical aggression? I think that has been already tackled by Dr. Martha. Now, over to you, to Omar, to give us some understanding of the same. And also, as you wrap up, you can reflect on, exit of AMISOM. The elections will be over. What does this really mean? I mean, finally, as a political actor that doesn't recognize democracy, doesn't recognize this idea of election, what does this really mean in the end? Is it just an exercise in futility? Will this government which come in will still be considered as legitimate and considered to be an apostate, as usually Shabaab and groups like this do? Over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Dr. Wario. I mean, maybe first just on AMISOM quickly. So essentially, you've had this African Union peacekeeping force in Somalia since 2007. And what they've been able to do is provide some space for Somali government to advance and Somali security sector to advance as well. But they have kind of hit a wall. They haven't been able to go a little bit further than that. And so you had this status quo where AMISOM is very important in order to prevent a reversal of security gains, but you're not progressing further. It's kind of at a standstill. And so that's why the discussions around AMISOM and its future have been so difficult, because no one wants to see it completely leave, but at the same time, everyone recognizes the need for some significant changes. And so what's come out of this is there's going to be a new mission called the ATMIS. So it's now a transition mission. The word transition is built into the name. That's going to last for the next 33 months. And there's a phased transition plan about handing over to Somali security forces. And so we'll see how that transition goes, because it's still dependent on conditions on the ground. And honestly, it's more or less the same discussion that's been going on 5 or 6 years by now. But you know, the funding for AMISOM's always been a problem, and it is kind of dwindling as well. So there's a need to kind of shift from this African Union force to more Somali-led forces. But there's, you know, a lot of political issues and that kind of get wrapped into that. So at least there's a transition now on paper. We'll see about the implementation around that. I think there was also, you know, the interesting question about why people become extremists. I think it's useful maybe just to interrogate that for a second in the Somali context as well. And what I would say is a group like Al-Shabaab is often a vehicle for a wide range of interests and activities. So to understand really how Al-Shabaab got its start, I mean, this was in reaction to Ethiopia's invasion of Somalia in 2006, 2007. So really, at that time, a lot of people even viewed Al-Shabaab as freedom fighters. They were defending Somalia. They were defending Somalia against a historic adversary. And yes, they seek this in this very conservative Islamist language, and presented this really as a struggle against a Christian adversary in Ethiopia. And so that's kind of the rhetoric they used. But people didn't necessarily come to them just for that, but they came to them for you know, to prevent Ethiopia from coming in and whatnot. And we've seen Al-Shabaab change that narrative now, not just from an anti-Ethiopia one, but to an anti-foreign intervention in Somalia as a whole. So that's one area where they're a vehicle for certain interests. They're also a vehicle within Somalia for those who have grievances against the state or against other clans within the clan system. Often you see smaller clans that have no other way of really challenging the status quo ally with a group like Al-Shabaab, because there are minority clans, and Al-Shabaab presents that vehicle again to challenge the state and the status quo. So I think there's a lot of different reasons beyond the ideological side, and especially I would argue within the case of Somalia today, the vast majority of those who are part of Al-Shabaab are not there for ideological reasons. You know, I think that kind of has faded a little bit, and it's really these other reasons that drive that. In terms of looking at Al-Shabaab as a political actor, or Al-Qaeda as a political actor, and what the aims might be in a place like Somalia, you know, I think we'd have to look more specifically at Al-Shabaab itself. Yes, Al-Shabaab is aligned to Al-Qaeda, but I think Al-Shabaab is quite independent in their thinking and quite autonomous in terms of what they do in Somalia. And basically what they've been arguing, you know, is the removal of foreign forces from Somalia. That's been a key demand from day one, and for implementation of Sharia law. Now, of course, they have a very specific interpretation of that, which I would argue is not representative of wider Somali society, but a very narrow interpretation. But if you zoom out a little bit, these are demands that aren't necessarily unpopular across Somalia. You know, the foreign troop presence is very controversial, and this is one reason why there's now a transition in place for AMISOM. And implementation of Sharia is actually, you know, seen as something that's very useful in Somali society. So if you zoom out a little bit, Al-Shabaab's demands aren't that radical from what, you know, wider society is maybe looking for. It's just their interpretation is a little bit too extreme. And so where we argue through maybe there's a need for dialogue or approach is to say, okay, you know, these are the demands. You're over here, we're over here, but, you know, is there a way we can narrow that space a little bit? Because I think if you can walk them back a little bit, then those are actually some things could be implementable within the Somali case study. Sure.
As we wrap up now, there's a question that has come for both of the speakers, and this is really a fascinating discussion. I wish we could be having 2 to 3 hours in order to interrogate these questions that are being raised by our audience. And I wish to raise one final question to both of you. And the question is asked in this way: how do gender and women and peace and security agenda fits in the intervention and the approaches you have been working on? I think this is directed to Dr. Martha. Could you speak a little bit about any specific gender dimension to violent extremism you have seen in your work? And
Indeed,
and there's
sorry.
also a question, not a question, perhaps a comment. In Silencing the Gun, the youth themselves are the forefront of some of the initiatives to tackle the spread of violent extremism. In East Africa, Commonwealth Youth Peace Ambassadors Network is working to address. So this is sort of giving some of the best lessons that are going on. Omar has raised a very critical question, for instance, around international community assisting the Somali government in trying to establish a stable government there, and especially the role of AMISOM and so on. Dr. Martha, as you wrap up and you have your final word on the challenges the CSOs, for instance, face in addressing the problem of violent extremism, and in very few words, maybe about 2 minutes, and then Omar can reflect going forward. What do we think is the future of the counter violent extremism and counterterrorism in Somalia? Given that again we'll have had the results of the election perhaps in the next couple of months, maybe the presidential election will be done, but then there's a lot of fallout from this electoral process also, because a lot of people feel that they were given raw deal. It's not the kind of elections we usually have in the region where it is one man, one person, one vote. So it's a very complex electoral structure that is often done in Somalia. But going forward, what do we think is the future of the CSOs in fighting against violent extremism? So to Dr. Martha first, and then to Omar second, as we wrap up.
Yeah, let me say is that I just gave a snippet because we talked of civil organizations, which was very specific. But I'd like to say this is that we are working very closely with women organizations doing peace building and additionally violent extremism and training. Just last week, in fact, we had a training with the women organizations from Eastern Africa that we were training them on issues to do with the strategy communications and how they can be able to apply them. We have about 100 women organizations that we have been able to map at the IGAD Center of Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism. And I would say that the network is growing, and we are delighted to be working with women on the ground. We are cognizant of the fact that the women perspectives are very critical in terms of winning this war of violent extremism. And so, in as much I did not say much about it, is that we are closely working with women. And additionally, let me just say that even religious leaders, we have a network of teachers, we have a network of media. There are so many networks that we are working with, because we are cognizant that it is very critical then to look at these different actors in terms of PCV. I don't have much time. You've given me 2 minutes, so I'll stop at that point. Thank you very much.
If we want to come back to you, we will do. Omar, to you, the future of CSOs in fighting against V in Somalia, but also reflect on the current political activities and its perhaps impact on fighting, going forward, fighting violent extremism, in this case, Shabaab, and you may say one or two other things as you finalize.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we could talk for hours on these subjects. They can be quite intricate and complicated, so it's hard sometimes in a short amount of time. But hopefully, we get some insights from this as well. But essentially, on the elections, I think there's going to be, as you mentioned, Dr. Wario, a significant fallout from that, and the impact of that is going to be that essentially, post-election, there's going to have to be time built in for reconciliation and for healing and kind of addressing some of the grievances that have emerged from this process. I think if you move forward without doing that, it's going to come back in certain ways and kind of become a bigger problem down the road. And we've seen that process basically happen before. So I think there's this idea that as soon as you finish the elections, you can kind of get back to all the things that were happening before. But I would argue, because this election has been so divisive, you actually need to take some time focus on the reconciliation side of things. And Al-Shabaab is very good about exploiting that. If you don't get that unity and that purpose, then you're fighting against an actor that is more united, and I think you're always going to be at a disadvantage. When it comes to CSOs going forward, I think they play an important role in kind of questioning the current strategy and kind of coming up with alternative ideas, and even honestly being able to reach out to the average population in areas where the government can't go. Because of the security situation, the government is, in these urban areas, there's not a lot of penetration beyond that. So I think there's a lot of voices that aren't captured and aren't heard. And so civil society organizations can play a very key role in kind of bringing those voices into the wider discourse. And I think one of the ways going forward is probably going to be this question of, can we engage Shabaab in some sort of dialogue as another tool within this? I think civil society organizations will probably drive some of that agenda post-election as well.
I will end it at this, and I will welcome our audience to also take very keen interest in some of the productions, analytical pieces that are extremely fascinating and in-depth, that are both churned out by IGAD, Center for Addressing the Problem of VE, and also International Crisis Group, not just on the Somalian conflict, but also other dynamics that we have in the region. I will hand over to Oge at the moment, and I wish to extremely thank the organizers for putting this forum together in order to address this key problem that the region of East Africa and the Horn of Africa faces, especially at the moment where we have now global crises in places like Russia and Ukraine, and rising costs of living across the region, also similar kind of civil war or similar kind of crisis in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in South Sudan, and so on. So the region itself is quite experiencing very various forms of conflict. But by and large, the audience should also pay very close attention to the kind of academic and policy production that both of these organizations affiliated to our two speakers are producing on a very regular basis. So I'll hand over to Oge at the moment, and we are very much thankful to both of our speakers. Thank you. Oge.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wario, for your moderating. This was a very engaging session, and thank you so much to our speakers, Dr. Njiri and Omar. We hope you guys enjoyed the session, and we have a few more to come after this one. Thank you so much.